Thank you to Transit for organizing this, and of course to Teresa and the rest of the team for the hospitality, and of course for the generous invitation. So I think I would start with, it would be a little bit uncomfortable actually to start this lecture presentation with some sort of a disclaimer. On one hand, the disclaimer arises from a position of trying to struggle with how can you produce sincerity in this kind of frame of discourse where, of course, discourse right now is pretty much put into a transaction. So it's like a currency of exchange, not just in the field where it usually is given to, but also, of course, in artistic production. And of course, the notion of critical production as always something that is prioritized, for instance. But also at the same time, the disclaimer is also on the notion that it is a lecture, that it is, in a way, a unilateral position, which at one point, it might be entertaining the idea of a monologue, but also at the same time, I think that the notion of lecture in itself could be dialogical, especially if it's being said and being performed from a very specific position. Or say, for instance, of course, we are all familiar, for instance, of the notion of being a subaltern. But I've been thinking a lot about the notion of the discursive architecture, precisely because of my subject of research in curatorial work lies in the notion of criticality and naivete. But it's something that you can't easily, lay out. And for the past few years, my investment is into how can you create a discursive architecture for criticality and naivete. So naivete as something that is not about ignorance, or naivete as something that is not opposed to cynicism, for instance. So I've been doing a lot of projects, and also at the same time curatorial and editorial projects. And this specific lecture will be titled Betting on the Strong. And this specific lecture is a new fragment on my ongoing research. So I have to apologize for how it appears to be like a run-on sentence, It's not a fully formed, like an essay kind of format of lecture, but I'll be reading fragments from my research projects, not to be taken as case studies or representations of specific connections, but rather as moments in which we could arrange these moments in thinking about the discursive architecture of criticality and naivety. The entire lecture presentation will be divided into 4 images, but unfortunately the lecturer will not present images. So I will start with the first image. Image 1, unity of purpose. It is for this reason that it is time to discover a common ground on which disparate systems may discover a cooperable enterprise. In Asia, what is more worthy than the uplift societies that are left in partial or total disarray by centuries of either colonial domination or by their own divisive conflict? Will it be difficult for all of us to unite toward this one humanitarian goal? There are at least 2 objections that may be raised against it. none of which is answerable. One is what one might call ad hominem argument. The other is perhaps political one. It may be argued that since these countries have embarked on nationalistic courses on their own, why bother? This is a so be it attitude. It says that nations that have rejected the guiding hand, the assistance that could have been theirs, should be left alone to their own devices. I would consider this view, I believe many of you would agree with me, as a short-sighted, even inhuman one. Nothing is to be gained by it. It perpetuates a Cold War view that I trust has been consigned to the same dustbin of history. It is an offense to human sensibility. The political argument, however, is a more difficult and challenging idea to contend with. I premise it with the view that within the collective responsibility of man for fellow man, everyone must share that responsibility. Hence, any regional institutions, such as the Asian Development Bank, in order to be true to its publicly proclaimed mission, must welcome the participation of all, regardless of social, political, or economic considerations. Of course, the question can be immediately raised. How can this be, since the bank is regarded as a capitalistic institution? How can socialist states join its endeavor? The answer is to try to transcend the name, calling and to bring to the fore the only purpose for which the institution can be acceptable to the peoples of Asia. Its dedication to their development and to their emancipation from whatever bondage still prevents their attaining to their aspirations. To this, the institutions must commit itself wholeheartedly, for only with it can it be rid of all nagging suspicions as to its purposes in the region. But what with it the differences among social and political systems can converge, can be reconciled to one common universal purpose. Greater independence of all nations is the most practical method, stopping the fatal swings of pendulum of power and advantage. It will serve the interest of all parties. In this way, the bank will rid itself of the stigma that may be attached to it, at times giving it an aspect of a bygone era in which the interests only of the powerful and the wealthy were served by it. Image 2, Art and the Social Dreamer. Surrounded by all this beauty, both natural and human, who can say where dream ends and reality begins? I can only fall back on prosperous words that we are such stuff as dreams are made of. Before all this art and necromancy, one conclusion is inescapable. The First Lady has the sorceress gift of making dream into reality, and reality into a dream. What poor mortal can cope with that? It is an inviolable position, albeit a terrifying one, for a man to be in. That this beloved sorcery should be cast here in Mount Makiling is rather symbolic. As you all know, this mountain retreat, as legend has it, was the home of the goddess of grace. That is to say, she could dissipate the forces of nature and save human beings from natural calamities and disasters. Her beauty, generosity, and romanticism were, to be redundant, legendary. Who can say now where legend ends and actuality begins? Romanticism. There is a touch of magic at the center of our lives. We are all romantics in our secret hearts. This magic, this romanticism, is the province of the artist, who, through the alchemy of his art, lifts us from the barbaric to the sublime. Otherwise, we can only be existing in one dimension, perhaps the lowest dimension of our being. For this, the dreamer, the artist, may all visionaries deserve our gratitude and homage. We class the artist, the dreamer, and the visionary together, but in many respects, it is the artist which elicits most of our envy. With the brilliance of his imagination, he is able to cause in us an experience unimperiled by decay. This is a privilege, a circumstance of genius, that is the nostalgia of a singular dreamer, the social dreamer. To create a universe of words, a world of colors, a configuration of sounds, rhythms, movements, and exalt thereby the human spirit is, let us say, a consummation devoutly to be wished. But how one does proceed in creating a small community of men, a modest society that is gently shaped according to the heart's desire? That is a problem of violence and tenderness, of harshness and compassion. During the Renaissance, it was thought by artists who would be princes, and princes who would be artists and philosophers, that the state could be a work of art. In that brief historical moment, art and power were not so strange bedfellows. With such consequences, however, that we have mixed feelings about Florentine or Renaissance politics. But the dream was there, or the vision, if you will, and perhaps one failure is not a permanent interdict. That the man of imagination and the man of political vision may once again be partners in the making of a society is probably not so remote in our time. We realize the dangers, of course, political or social attempts to mobilize the artist, as recent history shows, has often proved disastrous to the artist. The irony is that some artists, fired with revolutionary fervor, have been responsible themselves for the mobilization and the consequent trivialization, even brutalization of art. In other instances, with society's recognition of the artist has not himself understood how he is to accept the recognition of society. But that is a peripheral problem. The crucial one is how to socialize the artist without corrupting his vision and violating him as a human being. For the social dreamer, this is a problem, if not a dilemma, of painful difficulty, since the social dreamer has many affinities with the artist. The matter has to be faced. If art and power, as we find in the Renaissance, did not necessarily have political consequence, has our modern politics, with the divorce of art from power, been any better? In our world of interrelatedness, in a society where a holistic rather than fragmented approach is essential, how can anyone, let alone the artist, tolerate a continuing alienation? The supreme goal of any good society is the communion of man with man, a deep commitment to the humanity in all of us. Societies which consign their artists to entertainment along with clowns and jesters have forgotten to dream. And ceasing to dream, they forsake the humanity in whose service they were established. Thus, the artist in our time is beleaguered with commercialism on the one hand and totalitarianism on the other. The resistance must come from the artist himself. The accommodation must originate from society. The purity and the freedom of the artist is at stake every moment of his life. No one, therefore, can have a more intimate stake in the workings of society than the artist himself. It seems to me that his final issue lies in human contact, that is to say, in the interaction between art and power, society and man, imagination and will. It is an enterprise that cannot be completely programmed, for there must always be for the artist a zone of rebellion against the human condition, which the social dreamer must always take into account. World. But the dream of a new society, of a new world for humanity, is essentially a rebellion against the human condition too. There is then an area of agreement between the artist and the social dreamer, the man of imagination and the leader of vision. For whether one is a worker, a statesman, a businessman, a scholar, a soldier, a clergyman, one dreams of a better world. One envisions a great community. All are artists in their dreams and visions, so let us bring these dreams and visions together and create a whole in the ultimate dream of human fraternity. We shall achieve on this basis the unity of our dreams, and above all, the concert of our efforts. Our objective is a society as the art of man in his infinite diversity. I have not forgotten my dream as a young man seeking solitude in this quiet mountain. Each of us has his and her own makiling. We shall, therefore, be measured according to our fidelity to our dreams. I accept this measure. I urge you to accept it with me. Image 3, Removing Constraints. In his essay titled Aby Warburg and the Nameless Science, Agamben speaks about the space of interval through the practice of Aby Warburg's teaching and method. Symbols, Agamben reading Warburg, lie in the intermediary zone between consciousness and primitive reactions. In a more profound articulation, Agamben furthered the condition of the interval as a process, describing it as an, to quote, iconology of interval, or, to quote again, psychology of the oscillation between the process, between positing of causes as images and as signs. In the opening of this lecture, in the first two images, I called upon the precarious images from two speeches of the late Philippine dictator, Ferdinand Marcos, as intervals and sutures. The first image is a speech given to the Asian Development Bank, our own regional version of International Monetary Fund, and of course connected to International Monetary Fund. And the second image is from a speech by Ferdinand Marcos on the creation of the National Arts Council, which he constructed on top of the mountain in like 4 hours away from the capital, Manila, which envisioned to train future artists and cultural producers in the country. I called upon the precarious images from these two speeches as interventions, intervals and sutures, after being injured being spoken again, and before being inducted. Warburg's interval could very well be the place for images to heal, then disclose. In short, this is the space where images speaking to us might originate. However, Agamben reminds us that taking images as a political space for speaking, or for film theorist Kaya Silverman, a political space for looking, is very tricky. For Agamben, the image cascades through a continuum of different stages of undress, namely, of the mythical, psychosomatic character given to it, third, in the presence of an equally mythical object, or fourth, by a theory of knowledge that is, in truth, simply disguised metaphysics. When the image lays itself bare at what had been named as interval, it does not necessarily undergo a recovery. Instead, it becomes a conjunction for narratives. When narratives are formed, closure as their contingent feature is activated. How do images reclaim their intermediary position in the accumulation of narratives? The problem of images and narratives at an interval might be resolved in veering away from the tiresome critique to the power of institution, or institutional gaze, and the imposing knowledge enclaves. It is immediate to return within Agamben's essay, while tying it to feminist construction of the spectator in relation to feminist cinema. De Laurentiis clarifies that the spectator is always double desiring. She could embody a desire for the other, she says, and a desire to be desired by the other, she says. This characterization of the subject enables an agency, a resistance, along the narrative flow, invoking an image of neither a lonely reflexive actor or critical actor or a risk-taking radical, but an Oedipal character with vengeance, to quote De Laurentiis. According to her, understanding of the subject is founded on a scenario or a situation which foregrounded the subject in what Warburg calls as the interval. It is through foregrounding that images can place themselves in the interval. The image, evinces the possibility of overcoming the opposition between conscious expressions and unconscious conditions, especially if it strips itself not only at the interval, but within compounding intervals, such as discursive formation or certain material existence. Staging subsistence. So this third image is divided into removing constraints and staging subsistence. And why are these titled specifically as such? Removing constraints and staging subsistence are two methodologies used in development work. So for instance, in research centers of development agencies, for instance, they're interested into the notion of removing constraints. You know, so for you to be able to apply development in a new context or in a place that needs to be developed, you have to remove constraints. And after removing constraints, the next step would be to stage subsistence. So there's a kind of choreography of making the context sufficient and full and healthy after being after other elements such as labeled as constraints are being subtracted from it. So this kind of dialectical apparatus as well of infrastructures that they're also able to do that, the notion of removing constraints and then staging subsistence. So staging subsistence. Images are schizophrenic. They can reside at the interval, but also they show themselves to the world constantly. Images straddle multiple intersecting lines of overlapping circles. In discussing how the movement of images to and in the world, two circles provide us with their process of inauguration. Kaya Silverman, excavating Freud's theory of the drive, sketches a beautiful metaphor called circle of affiliated memories, in order to conceive how we become speakers in a world of visual languages. Silverman's circle of affiliated memories coincide very well with Heidegger's hermeneutic circle of understanding. As the latter circle broadens its spiral curve, with the passage of images, images continuously seek out for same connections as they tread the borders of the mental and the somatic, the visual and the linguistic, and the seer and the seen. However, it must be noted that Heidegger's circle, the hermeneutic one, is the plane convenient for the rationality and the rigor of humanities and social sciences. Images, following the circle of affiliated memories ideally, can endure this circle by intensifying its spiral movement and by capitalizing on its capacity to displace and being precarious in itself to be displaced. The spiraling images can be initiated in the circle we hold so dear, but it can only be sustained in the fixation that the circle of affiliated memories can give rise to. So the significance of fixating images, classified as ideational, representative by Silverman through Freud, draws from its permanent attachment to the drive. Here, the relationship enables displacement. So this notion of relating to the world, which acts as a process of transfer of libidinal desires between the image and other memories. This fixation in itself becomes a pregnant conduit where the image in place is inundated with memories. The fixation, therefore, forms a circle that resists foreclosure and always in the process of displacing memories, preventing the return of the so-called pre-conscious memories or complicit memories. Instead of becoming faithful to law of speech, the image remains schizophrenic, always liberating itself from a circle and continuously conducts a topographical arrestation. In this sense, the image shows itself to the world by inaugurating further displacements. Conversely, the image unites and throws itself in a community which cannot be a community of something into which we are appropriated and from which we are subsequently separated. And this is how the image cures and discloses itself in a displacement that shows and liberates. So I think just to connect that to the first two images, precisely, there was this kind of staging of foreclosures in these images. And if you remember how the second image of the relationship of the artist and the social dreamer has been instrumentalized and really rigorously and even philosophically unpacked by a statesman, and the notion of the artist and the visionary, and the notion as well of the social dreamer as the manager and management. So I think and the notion of the possibilities of how do you displace those images that are being invested into it already. So I think we will proceed that with the last part. But just to play this as a last. The last image. In 1976, the unofficial axis of power formed by France, West Germany, Italy, Japan, the United Kingdom, and the United Six, known as Group of Six, solidified its strength, accommodating Canada in the coalition to become the Group of Seven. In the same year, in an archipelagic space of Mindanao, in the Philippines, a former Moro-dominated island, closer to Malaysia and Indonesia than to its Hispanic capital Manila, power seemed to have melted, strength defrosted. The impact of electrification on the Maranaos was dramatic. When power first came to the municipality of Sagiran, people gathered under the streetlights, marveling at the unaccustomed brightness. General Abat said the power service has definitely contributed to the psychological feeling of security. Abat, I have always told them that when there is light, they can see each other. And when they can see each other, they can better understand each other. One of his senior aides, Colonel Jose Magno Jr. of the 3rd Infantry Brigade, elaborated, the Maranaos don't want war anymore. If there's war, their fridges may defrost. Brightness here, an index of power and a radiation of strength, settled as something unfamiliar that the people need to know, to relate with, to keep it glowing. Understanding the changes that brightness brings, its recipients must be mobilized and organized, while they disclose themselves under the lights. However, a light bulb integrated in a period of rat infestations and ethno-religious conflicts is enlightenment, capital E, hanging from the tree of development, both a recuperation and reification of a long-held European thought of unlimited progress and self-organization. The disjunctive presence of brightness in the ecology of strengths and the economy of security ushers the approach of betting on the strong. So betting on the strong, I don't know if you're familiar with the phrase, but it's used colloquially by development workers as a way, as a method in terms of their field work. So the idea of betting on the strong is that when you go into a field work or you immerse yourself in a new context, you have to choose one family or say one person who has this kind of potential to be able to replicate or to be able to perform your notion or to materialize your notion of development. So within this kind of disenfranchised or already oppressed situation, you have to choose one who is strong. So this kind of notion of betting on the strong. So in the disjunctive presence of brightness in the ecology of strengths and the economy of security ushers the approach of betting on the strong as a proposition to historicize the production of strength, and therefore a grid to historicize how strength is accumulated, distributed, and maintained. Temporarily, the museological, and of course the curatorial, and its network is de-escalated from their critical position as a watershed to a partition between structure and agency. So perhaps, I mean, Eastern Europe is also like a recipient of development era, of course, but there's an interesting phenomenon in different changes of development work where when culture was used in development, there was this kind of transfer from structure to agency. So that's why you have you see a lot of cultural work being developed within the development sector, because this notion of de-escalating the power of the state and to proceed that power to individual actors. So this notion of structure versus agency, where management of risk and coordination of effectiveness are necessary in cultivating strength. Here, betting on the strong conceives the developmental in the museological or the curatorial. The museological is not enlisted here as a development project or performed as a history of development. The condition of the museum is a site for the affirmative solidarity of strengths, an assembly of toned agreements. It prioritizes the engagement with growth and vitality. Developmental emerges as antagonistic to the artistic and the intellectual. Its political roots with modernity as something capable of turn, sociological, cultural, anthropological, collaborative, or simply radical, are injured. Its social life based on reflexive autonomy is handicapped, but still connected to a relapse of this epistemological violence. When the developmental would be seen as a cumulative deterioration and maldistribution of strength, historicizing strength doubles now as a fertile ground to historicize discontinuities and infirmities. Betting on the strong has endured the study of strength in scenes and sites where the museological and developmental are indeterminate. It is usually divided into two stages. First, following the nutritive mechanism of development, which means strength flows from the source to the recipient, And second, the hierarchy of preservation. Strength must be restored in the universally important before it arrives in the normatively good. So you can see this again with the notion of betting on the strong, so you have to choose, so you have to create a hierarchy among a social order in which who is the most important must be preserved first. So it's connected to the notion, for instance, of monopoly of seed or the monopoly of agriculture, and then so there was this like demand to preserve seeds, and then now you don't have seeds in context. So this is a product of the notion of development and the notion of preserving growth and vitality. So you now have seeds just in Svalbard in Norway, but you don't have seeds to be exchanged, which promotes like a monological agriculture. This will make sense, I guess, in a discussion later on, but that's the case. So unlike the format of case studies, betting on the strong delegates the inquiry in configuring disproportionately aligned tools and states, as subjected in the force of nutrition and preservation. Betting on the strong will always be slightly out of focus, sliding through subjects and objects, delirious perhaps, like the shared future of development and museums. For instance, museums and development research institutes, like the International Rice Research Institute, two polarizing infrastructures, share the event of confrontation between crisis and emancipation. The former relates with art as a tool or device, and the latter envisions seed as the core of problem solving. The museological and developmental interpenetrate in their metabolism and in the formation of their strengths in relation to what they stage to be as their recipients. The consignment of usefulness between the source and the recipient is also a function of universally important and normatively good. Ultimately, betting on the strong is a gymnasium where the museological and developmental are panting, always profusely sweating. In articulating strength, betting on the strong inflects strength's rigor and criticality in the passage of infirmity and discontinuity, always suspending the eventual solidification. Solidification being to be collected, to be educated, and to be exhibited. In turn, it extinguishes the triumphalist brightness of development and defrosts the extractive potential of the museum, the critical, and the artistic. So that's it. Yeah. So maybe again, I missed to mention earlier that since it's a run-on sentence kind of lecture, it's conscious on the way how it introduces discomfort and delirium. So again, it's not a fully formed hypothetical or theoretical work as you would expect from lectures where this kind of notion of coming into full circle. So these four images, which you didn't really see any images of them, are like performances of text in a way to conjure other levels of images. But again, these are not case studies in order to promote a certain argument or a theoretical discourse. So these are temporary vectors or placeholders where you can think of the notion of developmental within the context of the artistic and cultural production. So for instance, in the first two images, so these are speeches which were delivered in 1975 and 1976, and its connection to what I've been playing as an intermission is a piece by Jose Maceda called Udlot Udlot, which literally means actually protruding, so like continuously protruding. But the English translation that the artist used is hesitations. So Udlut Udlut was part of like a national artistic project during the dictatorship time, where when the Philippines was able to connect to a domestic satellite system, it launched a radio program in which people could hear sound music. So the artist produced this kind of ethnological study of music, vis-a-vis how it relates to classical arrangement, for instance. But again, it falls into this kind of notion of going back to the classical mode of what music is and trying to promote how ethnological sound could achieve a certain strength in order to be called art, for instance. But again, this was produced in the context of the dictatorship, where the notion of developmental is a phrase used by the state to refer to progressive development. So you always produce something in order to catch up with modernity or with modernization. And this was not just a loose phrase to use, but actually really concretized, meaning the conjugal dictatorship of Marcos ordered to reclaim sea in order to build a cultural center, for instance. For instance, we hosted the first IMF summit in Asia, and Imelda Marcos, the first lady, wanted to have the grandest version of the cultural center of the Philippines, which was a first in the context of Asia. So cultural development happened in 1970s, also at the same time when a lot of development money or money coming from agencies in Europe and in the US are flowing into it. So this cultural development is not disconnected to the externalities, for instance. So the notion, that's why it's very important that it has to be conjured as an image, the image of Asian Development Bank, as something that is crucial in the notion of developing artists and cultural producers in this context. And I think just in a way, not really to summarize the second part, but in a way also trying to position this. So it's not a historical lecture for sure. It's something that also responds to the contemporary problematics. So if you remember the second image about the art and the social dreamer, it really responds to this kind of participatory and community engaged turn in art, which has been very much discussed and very much discursified. But I wanted to ground that into a moment in 1976 when the notion of the art and the social dreamer, this kind of so the dictatorship was able to allow all these ideologies and all these possible radicalities into their own agenda. So, which was very clever. So at a certain point, we have also to think through how the state could play a role as the artist and the curator in itself, or the notion of, for instance, of the curatorial work within infrastructures. And I think just to say something, why was I showing this? Precisely because it's part of. So all of my projects are designed to respond to the discursive architecture of criticality and naivete. So it's not so much about content or accumulating theories, and of course these are theoretical, but the notion of how can you create discursive architecture in order for you to move around the notion of criticality, which is so much tied and rooted in the notion of Euro-American horizon. So how can you inaugurate a discussion of criticality? And I think one of the productive ways to go around it is to always create structures in order to create a discursive architecture. So for instance, this one is a project I did in Barcelona called Lighting Studies, Center for the Translation of Constraints, Conflicts, and Contaminations, in which I developed a discursive a 1-month discursive activity that confronts the notion of center of criticality with the notion of assembly of naivete, and both of them sort of share the same elements. For instance, the notion of constraints, but if you look into it, it's within the center of criticality. The notion of constraints becomes a condition of translation, for instance, while the notion of being constrained is a method in being naive. So these are temporary discursive architectures that are not fully unpacked yet. Which, for instance, in this new project, which is the second iteration of lightning studies, if you're familiar with it, basically it's an etiological chart used when you assess patients or when you assess medical illnesses. So in the first project that I did in Barcelona, it was about translation, but dealing with the notion of translation, relay translation of precarity, constraints, and all these things related to precarity vis-a-vis Europe and Asia. That's why you have this kind of, maybe one could easily thought that, you know, the notion of naivete would be consigned to Asia and the center of criticality would be consigned to Europe, precisely because you have a different relationship to precarity. And I think it's important to mention that it's based on the book Robinson Crusoe, and its relay translations from English to German, German to Dutch, Spanish, and to Bahasa Melayu, which is an Indonesian language, and to Filipino or Tagalog, which is a Philippine language. Anyway, so that was about the translation, and this etiological chart is about translation in transition. So I'm interested in the notion of how the notion of governing and control was translated during the transition period of the Spanish Empire to the American period, which happened in 1898 until the early 1900s. And I was looking into the production of public goods, specifically hygiene and health. So this is, I consider this, of course, it's a diagram / chart, but I consider it as an essay in a way. So I made this entire, so these terms are gathered and speculated and sort of taken from their context and arranged into this kind of essay diagram that provides a structure in order to think about the specific illness that I'm looking into is bruising. Bruising, yeah, you have a bruise, but in Filipino it's called pasa, but in Spanish there's que pasa, right? Which means like what's up, right? Que pasa, and then pasa actually, so it has this kind of pasa. It means bruising, just bruising, so just one, for instance. But pasa, which is another Filipino derivative of pasa, it means bruised all over, so you're full of bruised. So I'm presenting this as a kind of sort of, let's say, sort of the first paragraph in this diagram, but it uncovers and it will, this each case will be systematically explained through an archives of National Bureau of Sciences and National Bureau of Health. But it really speaks about how translation happened in public hygiene and public sanitation and public health during this period. Yeah. So I think that's it. I know it was delirious, and sorry about that, and thank you for your time. So if you have any questions, I will try my best to respond to them.
Maybe I have one question.
Yeah.
I would be interested if you could about how does this kind of wax relationship between the developmental and the arts and aesthetics and intellectual. I would be really interested in more practical side of the problem. How does it affect this thing you are working on theoretically, your own practical functioning as an intellectual, as a curator in Philippines or elsewhere? How would you describe your own tactics or strategies, or maybe you have another word or concept to describe it? How you move around the field of culture or politics, how you engage with different institutions, or
That's a really complicated question. I don't know how to.
For me, it's interesting because I assume the developmental, if I understand it clearly, relies on a strong power of the state.
Right.
Which is something I think here we don't really, or I don't know if I can speak in general, but my impression is that it's not really felt like we are not dealing with the problem of the strong state, but more problem of the weak state.
Right. I think.
So it's a difference, and then it affects your,
Right.
movement.
I also thought at one point that maybe dragging developmental into the discussion of aesthetics or the discussion of the politicality of images or art or all this constellation surrounding us would fall into a sociological or even anthropological project about images and about art. But I think the contemporary an immediate register that I always think of as something that for the longest time we haven't really accommodated the notion of developmental in our discourse, aside from as a sociological or anthropological or ethnographic take on it, has come us to a point where there's this kind of deregulation of everything into art. So for instance, which is totally different, for instance, with the notion of avant-garde production of art, and how, for instance, the rigor of socially engaged art or community-based artistic projects or curatorial projects and participatory art projects try to go away from that avant-garde connections already. So I was thinking that maybe this kind of line through development could be attached to this kind of discussion, and not just this discussion, but it's just one of those clear ideas. And why? Precisely because during the 1980s, there was a cultural turn of development, and this just didn't happen in Asia or in Latin America or in Africa. It happened all around the world, for instance. So it was very sophisticated in a way in which there's a notion of to destatize the state and then shares its functions into actors. And for instance, the specific case of Ferdinand Marcos was a sophisticated way of enabling and consigning that to the artist immediately. And now I think, for instance, it has come to a point where institutions or art institutions immediately assume that it's position. And so there's that kind of and another take on this, just because this notion of cultural development in art didn't actually really work, and developmental thinkers agreed that it didn't work. So continuing that development project was the notion of good governance. So it was first implemented in in Africa, for instance, where so the idea before good governance was that you are a bunch of development workers, or maybe also like now curators, or parachuting into a new place and then implementing new work, and without actually taking into account the kind of context, political struggles, and dynamics of power within it. So, with good governance, they accommodated the idea that, hey, we have to recognize the power structures within the field. So that was the continuation of that. But the problem with good governance is that, again, this is where betting on the strong comes in, where you rely on the domestic elite. So you also rely on another level of essentialism, where you are against capitalism, or you are against neoliberal forces, but you are actually promoting the notion of ethno-capitalism. So there's this kind of essentialist notion that when you go into a context, this power structure is actually good. So without thinking that in itself is a problem. So, and that's where they invested that instead of capacitating them, maybe it's about time to do good governance in them. So, and how this relates to art is a lot of discussions have been focused on, for instance, on how, for instance, art or art institutions or art as an institution in itself has to play a role within, say, for instance, discussion of social justice, climate justice. So this kind of sort of condition or situation that we're in right now. So how do we think of that through, and for me, it's important to go back to the notion of how developmental was constructed, not the developmental. So when you apply developmental in a new context, that has been changed already. The power players, the actors would always change that. So, but on another, I don't know if it will respond to your question, but I was reading recently Kaya Silverman's new book on photography, and she dedicated actually a chapter on the notion of unstoppable development of image. And I was really, really happy about that, precisely because, of course, she's Kaya Silverman, and that provides maybe you're on the right track. But that's not really, but it just connects to the idea that you could actually think of the notion of development. And of course, she's speaking about a different notion of development. But again, that might actually also lead to another discussion of developmental within art, And to respond to your practical question of navigating through, because I didn't study art, I studied psychology, a combination of Western and non-Western psychology, or post-colonial kind of psychology. So I'm coming from this kind of slightly odd register when I work in art, or when I think through art, for instance. But why am I always saying this part of my practice? Precisely because the movement of psychology in the Philippines has always been rooted into the indigenous, and also critical to the indigenous after it was strategically essentialist. But also the notion of empirical work within an interdisciplinary work is quite interesting for me. And I don't know, so for instance, the project in this second iteration of lighting studies will be part of a show as an artwork rather than as a curatorial work. So that also says something about how this kind of work is perceived. So yeah, I don't know if it responds to you. But basically, maybe I'm also like a material manifestation of developmental and its relationship with art. Of course, how funding agencies are structured, for instance. And you always, if you're coming from Southeast Asia or you're coming from these places, you would always be called in to sort of be part of a project, for instance. So I guess that's the most practical.
I'm so curious whether, because here let's say the ideological legitimization of art is based on the theory of creative industries, and so I would be interested if this. So basically, here when politicians, not politicians, but certain ideologues like I don't know to get confusing, but certain ideologues or elites who are trying to defend art refer to creative industries ideology. So I would be interested how, if this plays a role at all in Philippines or Southeast Asia, or if this is a...
Yeah, totally. I think it's actually really rooted in development, the notion of development work, actually. If you come to think of it, it all started with tourism, actually. So places like this have no other economic, well, this is just, like a really crash kind of thinking surrounding it. But if you come to think of it, a lot of these places without industries are dependent on the economy of tourism. And each economy has to sustain itself and to produce something out of their culture, So there was this project, for instance, in the Philippines where one town should have one project. So it's called One Town, One Project. So you have to fetishize your culture, all of your crafts, all of everything about your culture in order to be sold to the tourist. And this is actually a primordial notion of the creativity, how this creativity could be turned into a large-scale creative industry. And I think this is also in combination with, I don't know if it happens in Eastern Europe, but I heard like some Eastern European countries have become service industries. So like it's a place, it's a hub for business process outsourcing. So the Philippines and India are the major business process outsourcing. So when you say business process outsourcing, they're not just call center agents. So you outsource your labor from graphic design to the layout of your academic journal to legal matters. So this kind of transnational division of labor into it. And there's a lot of great creativity, a lot of creative sector actually operate on this level. So this has, I think it's much clearer if you talk about, for instance, Australia, which also copies the British creative industry model. But this is more perverse in places like India, the Philippines, and in Indonesia, where you don't call it creative industry, but it is the creative industry, and much worse, And this is like a lot of money flow into it, and a lot of regulations surrounding it. So you have very specific free economic zones for this, and that allows this. But there's no such thing for us as a formalized creative industry. But Indonesia is doing that already. They're building a department / a commission for that. There has been talks about that in the Philippines. But yeah.
Well, I will have more theoretical kind of question.
Yeah.
If I can. How to understand the concept of romanticism in relation to the notions which you use, like criticality or naivete, or the idea of an artist as a social dreamer and so on? What does romanticism
That's a really difficult question. Precisely because I didn't study philosophy of art. How do I respond to that? But romanticism was invoked in the speech of the late dictator. So there was a very specific, I don't know.
You mentioned the word romanticism.
Yeah, it's actually part of the speech of the dictator. It's under the heading romanticism. But I don't know how he envisions it.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, yeah.
So I presume that as a part of the speech it was some vulgar idea of romanticism.
Yeah.
We don't take it serious. But I think that the romantic tradition is very important for a bunch of concepts and ideas which you presented. Right?
Yeah.
For example, precisely this problem of a relation between criticality and naivety. And the romantic concept of irony is very important here. Because German romanticists has said that romantic irony is the maximum of naivety, and at the same time it is a maximum of criticism. It's criticism of criticism. And so I was just wondering, maybe this line of thinking may be somehow interesting. For example, in relation with that idea of an image as an interval, as something in between.
Right. Yeah, but also I'm also interested in the attachment of, you know, the difference between I think it's more connected. I think in the naivete that I'm trying to pursue is within the gaps of this avant-garde cynicism and the actual cynicism, the notion of cynicism as a watchdog, rather than how the avant-garde actually used cynicism into it. But also at the same time, this is again attached into the notion of how much can you enlarge your discursive sphere, and how much of this accommodation can be closed and open at the same time. So they are not just they are being invoked in order to enter into a discussion, but sort of like there's a trickster moment into it, you know. So for instance, and this is exactly, I think, how this kind of curatorial based or practice based or organizationally based kind of theory production, if one could say, would always come in friction with fully formed or even almost fully formed disciplines, because there's kind of that kind of arrogance into it, but also at the same time that kind of insecurity and kind of always self-flagellating itself. So it enters and then it punctures itself. You know what I mean? It's that kind of movement, I think, more of that. So yeah. So and also that's why it's. So for instance, I wrote an essay called "Potential Performance: Short Histories of Foreclosure," which is very much related to wit. Potential performance was used by a research institute called the International Rice Research Institute as their only core research since they started. And International Rice Research Institute is the institute that started Green Revolution. And Green Revolution 1.0, Green Revolution 2.0, and all this, you know, shit that's happening in you know, anyway. But their only core research is to close the gap between potential yield of a rice, of the plant, and its performance yield. And that's it. And they develop an entire infrastructures, produce disciplines, produce researchers and scientists to have this idea. But it also forecloses other things. So for instance, in Latin America and in the Philippines, in India, there's a monoculture of seeds, right? So this specific essay, I'm trying to mention it because it was never part of any academic or, serious journal or serious kind of conversation. It's not part of critical agrarian studies. It's not part of, any academic fields. But it was actually part of a book published by an artist and a poet called Slowly and Imperceptibly Opening, which is about plant thinking. So I mean, I'm saying this because it has a very weird register into these fields, and the only moment that it could enter if it's within this kind of literary, artistic kind of theoretical work. So it will be released. So I'm plugging the book, but it's an essay in a book of essays, but it's a really good book. We produced in Chicago. I don't know if I can have a copy actually, but anyway, so yeah, so that's why just to say that it always gets this friction in terms of other modes of thinking, because like, why would you talk about rice in the context of art, or why would you talk about rice in the context of the critical, this kind of thing? So yeah.
I'll think about rice.
Okay, no more questions. So
Thank you
Thank
so
you,
much
Renan.
for going through the ordeal with the lecture presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone interested in going with us for drinks or food, you can join us. Thank you.
Thank you.